Last Saturday at Vibe, Jake was pressed up against some brunette girl's back, dancing provocatively right in front of me, locking eyes with me the whole time like some kind of sociopath who wanted me to witness him utterly degrade me in public. I'm typing this out now, still so furious I can barely think clearly. This guy stared straight into my soul while his hands roamed over this random girl, and then said the most vile thing I've ever heard anyone say. Let me backtrack for a moment because I know you're all wondering why I was even there. Jake and I have been together for 10 months, and yes, I know that's not forever, but it felt serious. We moved in together after 5 months because his apartment lease ended, and I was naive enough to believe it meant something special. My family lives a couple of hours away, and I stayed in this city after finishing college. Jake earns a solid income and loves to brag about how he's got his life together compared to other guys our age. He's 27, I'm 25, and he's always pointing out how much more worldly he is than me. That was the first warning sign I completely ignored like a fool. So last Saturday, Jake decided we were going out with his colleagues to celebrate a big deal he closed at work. I should have sensed something was off because he spent ages getting ready, switching shirts 4 times, and dousing himself in cologne. When I asked if my red dress looked okay, he just mumbled that I looked decent. That's not out of character, though. Jake rarely compliments me unless he's after something. We arrive at the club and his entire demeanor shifts. He's buying rounds for everyone, acting like he owns the place, and making snide remarks about how the women there are dressed like they're actually making an effort. Every time a server comes by, he's all charm and grins, chatting them up like they're old friends. With me, he barely acknowledges I'm there. About an hour in, I'm chatting with Sarah, one of his coworkers, near our table when Jake sidles up behind this brunette at the bar. She's in a tight gold dress, undeniably stunning, I'll admit. But what happened next was so deliberate and cruel that I still can't believe it went down. Jake starts dancing with her, which fine, we weren't glued to each other. But then he positions himself so I have a clear view of everything. I swear he orchestrated it because he keeps glancing at me while he's all over this girl. His hands are on her hips, then lower, and she's moving against him, clearly into it. The music was loud, but not loud enough to drown out what he said when he leaned into her ear, making her laugh. Then he looked right at me and mouthed, "This is what a real woman looks like." It felt like a punch to the gut. Sarah saw it too because she grabbed my arm and suggested we step outside, but I was frozen. I just stood there watching my boyfriend of 10 months publicly humiliate me in the worst way possible. And it gets uglier. So much uglier. After about 10 minutes of this performance, the girl's friends pulled her away to dance elsewhere. Jake strolled back to our table like it was nothing, ordered another drink, and when I tried to pull him aside to talk, he chuckled and said I was overreacting. I told him what he did was completely out of line and that I wanted to leave. Jake looked at me like I'd said something ridiculous and said, "Babe, you're not pretty enough for me to cheat on. That was just dancing." The whole table went silent. Sarah audibly gasped. His friend Marcus muttered, "Man, that's cold," under his breath. Jake just stood there, smirking like he'd told a great joke. I was so stunned I couldn't speak at first. Then the rage hit, and I demanded he apologize immediately or I was done. Jake took a slow sip of his drink, glanced around at everyone staring, and said, "You should be grateful I even look at you. Compare yourself to the women here and tell me you're in their league." At that point, I was beyond done. Done. I grabbed my bag and headed for the exit, but Jake caught up and grabbed my arm. He said if I left, I'd be proving his point about being overly sensitive and insecure. He claimed the brunette was watching and that I was embarrassing him by causing a scene. Then he did something I'll never forget. He walked back to where the brunette was with her friends and brought her over to me. He introduced me as his girlfriend and told her I was upset about their dancing. The girl looked mortified and said she didn't know he had a girlfriend there. Jake told me to apologize to her for making things awkward because she was just having fun and didn't deserve my drama. He stood there waiting for me to apologize to this stranger for being upset that my boyfriend was all over her in front of me. I looked at this girl, who seemed genuinely nice and clueless about Jake's twisted game, and I did it. I apologized. I told her it wasn't her fault and that I was sorry for the situation. She was kind, said she hoped we'd sort it out, and quickly left with her friends. Jake acted like he'd just brokered world peace. He slung his arm around me and said, "See? That wasn't so bad. Let's have fun now." But I was done pretending everything was fine. I told him I was getting an Uber and going home. Jake said fine, but I was blowing things out of proportion and making our relationship weird over nothing. He said he'd talk to me when I was ready to act like an adult. The 20-minute Uber ride home was me sobbing in the backseat, replaying every moment. I kept thinking about how he planned it, how he made sure I saw, how he made me apologize. It was like he wanted to crush me in front of everyone. I got home and sat on our couch, waiting for him to come back so we could hash it out. Jake stumbled in at 3 a.m., plastered, and acted like I was nuts for still being awake. He said we'd talk when I wasn't being so emotional. Sunday morning, Jake gets up, makes coffee, and acts like nothing happened. When I brought up Saturday, he sighed like I was annoying him with something petty. He said he was sorry I got upset, but I needed to learn the difference between dancing and cheating. He said if I couldn't handle him interacting with other women, I wasn't ready for a mature relationship. I told him it wasn't about interacting. It was about grinding on someone while calling me unattractive. Jake rolled his eyes and said he was giving me a compliment by saying I didn't need to worry about other women. He said most guys wouldn't be so honest about how safe I was from competition, but he respected me enough to be upfront. I asked how calling me unattractive was a compliment, and he said I was misinterpreting him. He claimed he meant he chose me for my personality, not just looks, and I should be grateful for a guy who values substance over superficiality. He said the brunette was probably shallow, and he'd rather be with someone authentic like me. This man genuinely tried to spin publicly humiliating me as proof he was a great boyfriend. I told him that even if that's what he meant, which I didn't buy, making me apologize to that girl was unforgivable. Jake said I'd made everyone uncomfortable, and apologizing was the grown-up thing to do. He said it showed I could own my actions instead of playing the victim. Every time I pointed out specific things he said or did, he claimed I was misremembering or being too sensitive. By the end, Jake had flipped it so I was the issue. He said he'd forgive me for embarrassing him at the club if I worked on my jealousy. He suggested I talk to someone about why I get so insecure when he talks to other women. I just stared at him. This man had spent 2 hours convincing me I was crazy for being upset. I told him I needed space to process, and maybe he should stay at his friend Derek's for a few days. Jake laughed and called me dramatic, but said if I needed time to chill, he'd stay elsewhere. He packed a bag like he was doing me a favor, and said he hoped I'd be ready for a mature conversation when he returned. That was 4 days ago, and I haven't heard from him since. No calls, no texts, nothing. I've been replaying everything, and I keep finding new things that infuriate me, like how he made sure his coworkers saw it all, how he brought that girl over to humiliate me further, how he acted like I was insane for being upset. What's really eating at me is wondering what his ex went through and if this is just who Jake is. I keep questioning if something about me makes him think he can treat me like trash. I called my best friend Mia yesterday and told her everything. She was livid and said I should box up his stuff and leave it outside. She said no decent man would publicly degrade his girlfriend like that, and making me apologize was emotional abuse. First update, I thought the club incident was awful, but Jake came back yesterday, and I learned so much more about the kind of person I've been living with for the past 5 months. Thank you to everyone who commented on my original post. So, Jake waltzed into our apartment like nothing had happened. Just strolled in with his bag and started unpacking like he'd been on a casual trip instead of vanishing for 4 days after humiliating me. I was in the kitchen cooking when I heard his key in the door, and I wasn't ready for the confrontation we needed to have. Seeing him act so nonchalant reignited my anger. I asked where he'd been and why he hadn't contacted me since Sunday. Jake looked at me like I was being unreasonable and said he'd told me he was staying at Derek's to give me space to calm down. He said he assumed I needed time to reflect on my reaction at the club and get my feelings in check. The way he said feelings made it sound like I'd had a meltdown instead of a normal response to being treated horribly. I said we needed to talk about Saturday because I'd spent 4 days thinking and was even angrier. Jake sighed and said he hoped I'd gain perspective, but was willing to discuss it if I could be reasonable. That word reasonable set me off. I asked what was unreasonable about being hurt when your boyfriend dances provocatively with another girl while saying you're not attractive enough for him to cheat on. Jake said I was exaggerating and twisting his words. We went back and forth, with Jake insisting I was misremembering or taking things out of context. Every specific thing I raised, he had an explanation for. When I mentioned making me apologize to that girl, he said I chose to apologize because I knew I was being unfair to her. When I brought up the unattractive comment, he said I was turning a compliment into an insult. But here's where it gets wild. During this argument, Jake said something that made me realize he's been playing mind games for months. He said I have a history of overreacting, and maybe I should think about why I'm so insecure in our relationship. I asked what he meant by history, and Jake started listing times I'd supposedly overreacted. Like when I got upset about him talking about his hot coworker Lauren, or when I made a fuss about him liking some girl's Instagram posts, or when I got jealous about him grabbing lunch with his friend Emily. The thing is, I barely remembered these moments because they seemed so minor at the time. But Jake had cataloged everyone, keeping a mental list of my so-called jealous behavior. He said it was worrying that I couldn't see the pattern and that I needed to work on my confidence issues. As he listed these incidents, I realized Jake had been testing me this whole time. All those comments about other women, all those mentions of how attractive someone was or how fun his female friends were. He was watching my reactions and using them to paint me as the problem. I told him it felt like he'd been deliberately trying to make me jealous, then criticizing me for feeling what he wanted me to feel. Jake called that absurd, saying he's just a friendly guy who gets along with women. He said if I had an issue with him having female friends or noticing attractive people, that was my problem to fix. He never once admitted what he did at the club was wrong. Instead, he turned it into a critique of my flaws, saying my jealousy was ruining our relationship. By the end, he was suggesting I talk to someone about my insecurity issues. He said he loved me and wanted to make things work, but I needed to own my role in our problems. He said relationships require trust, and if I couldn't trust him to interact with women without getting possessive, we had bigger issues than one night at a club. I went to bed feeling confused and frustrated. Jake had a way of making everything sound logical when he said it, but something felt deeply wrong about the conversation. I kept thinking about how he'd planned the club incident, how he'd made sure I saw, how he'd brought that girl over to humiliate me further. Wednesday morning, I woke up still unsettled. Jake was already up, making coffee, acting like our talk had fixed everything. He was in a great mood, being affectionate and planning our weekend like nothing had happened. But then something strange happened while Jake was in the shower. His phone was charging on the nightstand, buzzing with notifications. Normally, I'd never touch his phone, but after everything, I was curious who was messaging him so early. I picked it up and saw Instagram notifications and texts. It was locked, but I could see message previews on the lock screen. There were several from unknown names, including what looked like messages from girls saying things like, "Good time last night," and "Thanks for the drinks." My heart sank when I saw a preview from someone named Nicole that said, "She doesn't know, right?" Lol. I stared at that message for a good 30 seconds, trying to figure out what it meant and who Nicole was. When Jake got out of the shower, I asked who was texting him so early. He said it was probably work or social media notifications. I mentioned seeing a message from Nicole and asked if she was someone I should know. Jake's demeanor shifted instantly. He got defensive, asking why I was looking at his phone. I said I wasn't snooping. The phone was buzzing and I saw the previews. Jake said Nicole was just a college friend and the message was about some random joke. But his tone felt off. He grabbed his phone, unlocked it, and turned away while checking his messages. When I asked about the joke, he said he couldn't recall and it wasn't a big deal. The rest of Wednesday was tense. Jake was on his phone more than usual, angling it away from me when texting. Every time I tried to revisit our Tuesday talk or ask about the club, he'd dodge or say we'd already covered it. By Wednesday night, I felt like I was losing my mind. Jake acted like everything was fine while I was still grappling with his manipulation and this mysterious Nicole. I called Mia again to talk it through. Mia listened to me recount the conversation with Jake and was even angrier than before. She said it sounded like Jake was gaslighting me and that tracking my reactions was manipulative as hell. She said normal boyfriends don't deliberately make their partners jealous and then blame them for it. But then Mia said something that hit hard. She asked if I'd ever checked Jake's social media posts about me or other women. I realized I hadn't because I'm not big on Instagram or Facebook. Mia suggested I look at his profiles for any red flags I'd missed. She said guys sometimes reveal their true feelings about their partners online. Thursday morning, while Jake was still asleep, I checked his Instagram. I'd never really dug into his posts before, but what I found made me nauseous. Jake's Instagram was packed with photos of him with attractive women. group shots from parties or work events where he was always next to the prettiest girls, photos from the gym where he was clearly showing off, pictures from bars and clubs I didn't even know he'd been to. But the worst part was his comments on other women's posts. Jake was constantly leaving flirty comments like stunning as always or fire emojis and wow, girl on his female friends' pictures. He was way more active on their posts than on mine. I scrolled back months and saw Jake had barely posted about me. In the few photos I was in, I was barely visible or looked terrible compared to others. Meanwhile, he had tons of photos showcasing other women or himself looking single. The worst was seeing how flirty he was in comments on other girls' posts. Jake was hyping up other women's looks while never saying anything remotely sweet about me on his social media. I was staring at months of proof that Jake didn't respect me or value our relationship, at least not publicly. His Instagram made him look single or casually dating. There was no hint he was in a serious relationship with someone he cared about. As I was scrolling, a DM popped up on my phone from Jake's friend Derek, the one Jake supposedly stayed with all week. Derek's message said, "Hey, can we talk? There's stuff about Jake you need to know." I replied yes, I wanted to talk. He suggested meeting in person because it was too serious for texts. We agreed to meet while Jake was at the gym. I spent the morning nervous about what Derek would say, but relieved that I might get clarity about Jake's behavior. Based on his social media and how he'd been acting since coming back, I was starting to think the club incident was just the beginning. I'll update after meeting Derek. Second update, I'm shaking as I type this, and I don't even know where to begin. The meeting with Derek happened, and you were all right about Jake being a total psychopath, but it's so much worse than I imagined. I met Derek Thursday afternoon while Jake was supposedly at the gym. I was a wreck walking in, part of me still wondering if I was overreacting, and Derek would say Jake was just misunderstood. Derek was already there, looking visibly stressed about what he was about to share. He asked if I wanted coffee, but I was too anxious to wait, so I sat down and asked what was going on. Derek said he'd been debating telling me for weeks, but after Saturday's club incident, he couldn't stay silent. He felt guilty for enabling Jake's behavior by not speaking up sooner. Then Derek dropped a bombshell. He said Jake had been planning the club incident for over a week. Jake had told Derek and other friends he wanted to put me in my place because I was getting too comfortable and needed a reminder of my place in the relationship. I asked what that meant, and Derek said Jake had been complaining about me for months, saying I was too clingy and needed to be humbled. The club incident wasn't spontaneous. It was a calculated move to humiliate me publicly. Derek said Jake chose that club because he knew there'd be attractive women there. He'd even visited the place the previous weekend to plan how he'd pull it off. Jake told his friends he wanted me to see him with someone who looked like real girlfriend material, so I'd know the difference. I was trying to process this when Derek kept going. He said Jake had been talking about me to his friends like I wasn't someone he loved, but a temporary project. Jake had called me his placeholder girlfriend, someone to practice with, until he found someone he actually wanted long-term. Derek said Jake rated me compared to other women, saying I was a 5 at best, but good for figuring out what he wanted in a real relationship. I felt sick but needed to hear it all. Derek said Jake had group chats with friends where they rated women they met or saw online. Jake had sent photos of me to one called The Crew and asked for ratings, then shared the results as proof he could do better. Derek showed me screenshots because he knew I wouldn't believe it otherwise. He showed messages from a chat where Jake sent a photo of me from a dinner we had for my birthday last month. The messages were brutal. Jake captioned it, "Rate my placeholder GF," and his friends gave me scores between 4 and 6. The worst was Jake's reply. "Knew it. She's a 3 on a good day, but she's easy to manage and doesn't push back." I stared at Derek's phone, reading these messages, feeling like I'd been gutted. These grown men were rating my looks like I was an object, while my boyfriend laughed and added his own cruel comments about how pliable I was. Derek kept scrolling, showing more messages where Jake shared private details about our relationship, arguments, things I'd confided in him, even intimate moments. Jake had been treating our relationship like a game for his friends' amusement. The worst message was from a few days ago after Jake returned from Derek's. Jake wrote, "Mission accomplished, she's broken down now. She's second-guessing everything and walking on eggshells right where I want her." I asked Derek if he'd been part of these chats, and he said he was in the group but never joined the rating games. He'd told Jake multiple times it was messed up, but Jake brushed it off, saying I'd never find out, so it didn't matter. Derek said he decided to tell me after seeing Jake gloat about the club incident like it was a win. But what pushed him over the edge was a conversation Jake had with someone else that showed how deep his manipulation went. Derek showed me screenshots of texts between Jake and a girl named Rachel. The texts were from earlier this week, after Jake came back to our apartment. Jake was bragging to Rachel about how he'd crushed me at the club and how I was now fully under his control. He said making me apologize to the brunette was the highlight because it proved I'd do anything to keep him. He said he'd been testing my limits for months to see how much I'd tolerate, and the club was his way of establishing total control. The messages were so cold, like he was discussing a business plan, not someone he claimed to love. He wrote about making me jealous and insecure, so I'd be grateful for any attention he gave me. Rachel asked if Jake felt guilty for manipulating me, and he replied, "Why would I? She stays. Every time I push her boundaries and she takes it, that's her choice. I'm just giving her what she'll accept." I was crying by this point, not just from sadness, but from pure fury. Derek handed me napkins and said he was sorry for waiting so long to tell me, hoping it wasn't too late for me to get out before Jake did more damage. Derek said there was more. He told me Jake had been seeing other women throughout our entire relationship, not just flirting, but actually cheating with multiple people. The brunette from the club wasn't random. Jake had been texting her for weeks and had hooked up with her before. Derek said Jake had a roster of women he saw when I thought he was working late or with friends. He'd used our apartment when I was at work or visiting my parents. Derek said Jake had taken women to our favorite spots, like our go-to cafe, and posted about it online to see if I'd notice. He showed me Jake's Instagram messages with several women, where Jake pretended to be single or casually dating someone who didn't matter much. The Nicole person whose message I'd seen was someone Jake had been hooking up with regularly. Her message, "She doesn't know, right?" Lol, was about Jake bringing another girl to a party they'd all been at while I was home with a migraine. Derek said Jake was living two lives. With me, the committed boyfriend. With everyone else, the single guy looking to upgrade. I asked Derek why he was telling me now, and he said the club incident was the final straw. Jake was getting crueler, and Derek was worried about what he might do next if I stayed. Derek also said Jake planned to dump me after his lease renewal in a few months. Jake had been using me for cheap rent and domestic support while searching for someone he actually wanted long-term. He told friends I was convenient, but not someone he'd stay with once he found a real girlfriend. Jake had even bet his friends on how long it'd take to completely destroy my confidence. Derek showed messages where Jake bragged about making me insecure and how I'd probably beg him not to leave when he was ready to move on. After 2 hours of Derek showing me months of evidence that my relationship was a lie, I felt numb. Everything Jake had said and done suddenly clicked. The way he tracked my reactions made me doubt myself and framed me as the problem. It was all intentional. Derek said he'd been carrying guilt for months for not speaking up. He'd tried distancing himself from Jake, but Jake just found other friends to share his tactics with. I thanked Derek for telling me, even though it was devastating. He said he had screenshots of everything and that I should keep them in case I needed proof. He warned me Jake would likely try to gaslight me more if I confronted him. I left feeling like my world had been flipped upside down. I'd been living with a stranger who saw me as a target for his mind games. The drive home was brutal, knowing I'd have to confront Jake about everything. But I also felt a strange relief because it all made sense now. All those times I felt crazy or oversensitive, I'd been right. I got home around 6 p.m. and Jake was there, cooking dinner like nothing had happened. He asked about my day, and I stared at him, thinking about how he'd probably been texting other women all afternoon. I said we needed to talk seriously, and he got that smug look, like he was bracing for another of my outbursts. He said he hoped I'd reflected on our earlier talk and was ready to own my part in our issues. That's when I snapped. I told Jake I knew about the group chat where he rated me and called me his placeholder girlfriend. I told him I knew about the women he'd been cheating with and that the club incident was planned to humiliate me. Jake's face went pale, then red. For the first time, he looked scared instead of smug. He started stammering, asking where I got that info and who I'd been talking to. I said it didn't matter because I had proof. Jake went into damage control, denying everything, saying whoever told me was lying to sabotage us, but I could see the panic in his eyes. Part 4, I can't believe what's happened since. Jake has completely unraveled, and I'm laughing at how pathetic he's become. When I left off, I just confronted Jake about the group chat and his cheating. His smugness vanished, replaced by sheer terror. He kept demanding to know who gave me the information, insisting they were lying to ruin our relationship. I pulled out my phone and read his own messages from the group chat, calling me a 3, easy to manipulate, his placeholder girlfriend. Jake first denied it was him, then said I was taking it out of context, then admitted it was real but just guy talk he didn't mean. He kept asking who had access to his messages and how they got to me. I told him I knew about Nicole, Rachel, the brunette from the club, and all the other women he'd been seeing. Jake went ghost white, stammering that they were just friends and I was misinterpreting things. Then I dropped the real bombshell. I told Jake I knew about his affair with his boss's wife. Jake looked like he was about to collapse, stuttering like he couldn't breathe. I had screenshots of Jake bragging to his friends about this married woman, the wife of his company's director. The messages were explicit, with her full name, photos, videos she'd sent him, and details of their meetups planned around her husband's business trips. Jake had documented the entire affair in vivid detail. When I said her name, Jake looked like he might faint. He forgot about figuring out my source and started begging me not to do anything with the screenshots. He promised to do whatever I wanted if I deleted them and kept quiet. I looked at this man who'd spent months tearing me down and said, "Oh, now you care about consequences." Funny how that works. Jake tried everything, saying I was invading his privacy, that my source betrayed him, that I was overreacting. But when I mentioned his boss's wife again, he crumbled. I told Jake he had 1 hour to pack and leave my apartment, since the lease is in my name because his credit is terrible. For the first time, he didn't argue. He just nodded and started throwing clothes into a bag like his life depended on it. While packing, Jake kept asking what I'd do with the screenshots and who gave them to me. I smiled and said I hadn't decided but was keeping them safe. Jake looked like he might vomit. He kept saying he needed to know who shared his messages so he could deal with it. I laughed and said that ship had sailed when he decided to document his affair. Before he left, Jake tried one last desperate plea. He said he was sorry that he'd made awful mistakes, but ruining his career wouldn't change anything. He said if I loved him, I wouldn't destroy his life over some dumb messages. I laughed in his face and said his life was already ruined. He did that himself. I said I wasn't planning to ruin anything, just keeping my options open if he bothered me again. Jake left that night faster than I'd ever seen him move. No threats about me regretting it. No claims I'd come crawling back, just panic about what I might do with the evidence. Friday morning, I felt incredible. I changed the locks and started tossing his leftover stuff. The best part was watching Jake try to worm his way back without admitting what he'd done. He sent desperate texts about making mistakes, but how we could work through it together. He said he'd delete his social media and cut off his friends if I promised not to share the screenshots. I ignored every message, which drove him nuts. By Friday evening, he was texting nonstop, switching between apologies and panic about his job. Saturday morning, Jake showed up at my building, buzzing the intercom repeatedly. When I answered, he was nearly crying, begging for 5 minutes to talk. He said he knew he'd screwed up, but ruining his career wouldn't help me. I told him through the intercom that I wasn't ruining anything. I was just living with the knowledge of his choices. If those choices tanked his career, that was his problem. Jake got desperate, offering money, a public apology, anything to make it go away. I told him the only thing I wanted was for him to leave me alone or I'd call the cops. Sunday morning, Jake started calling from different numbers since I'd blocked his main one.